What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christoforou with the Duran, and I have with me Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran.com. And today we're going to take a look at Vladimir Putin's meeting with the Turkish foreign minister and the head of Turkish intelligence. Alexander, we had a statement from the Kremlin which outlined the meeting of Russian President Vladimir Putin with the Turkish foreign minister, and as well as the Turkish defense minister, I might add. But present in that meeting, and this is what drew your attention to the statement from the Russian government as far as the framework and the outline of what was said during the meeting. But in attendance at that meeting was the head of the Turkish intelligence, Hakan Fidan. What do you think is the significance of his presence at that meeting? And give us your take as to what Vladimir Putin discussed with the Turkish foreign minister and all the other people present. From what we understand, it focused a lot on Syria, but give us your take as to what was going on here.
This is a very interesting development indeed, and it's interesting, by the way, that the international media hasn't really picked up on it. Now, can I just say a few things about Turkish military intelligence? I mean, President Erdogan, as we all know, survived a coup attempt in 2016. The institution within the military which remained loyal to him and which, in a sense, saved him was Turkish military intelligence. It was they who tipped him off that the coup was underway. It was they who basically helped him to escape arrest when the coup plotters were going to try and arrest him. And it was through their agency that he was able to mobilize his supporters and defeat the coup. Now, not only is Turkish military intelligence therefore very close to Erdogan, but it's also had the important role of coordinating the Turkish involvement in Syria, where it is Turkish military intelligence which has been backing the various Turkish-backed jihadi groups in Syria that have been fighting the Syrian government, and which has been arranging for them to get supplies and intelligence, and which has basically been conducting their operations. So this person that we see meeting with Putin, and it is not common for Putin, I should stress, to meet with intelligence officials in that way from foreign countries. That is extremely unusual. That person, the chief of Turkish military intelligence, is very close to Erdogan. He's very important to Erdogan. He's somebody who is very important in running things in Syria. And to those like you and me who are familiar with Turkey and with the reality of Turkish politics, we also know what a huge role Turkish intelligence plays in organising politics within Turkey itself. So this is a very important man, but a man who is very much in the shadows. So why did he come? Why was he there with Putin? And obviously, as you correctly say, the Kremlin is making out that they were basically talking about Syria, and there is a lot to talk about Syria because in Syria the insurgency is almost finished, it's almost been completely defeated. The one area where jihadi insurgents and terrorists and people of that kind are still holding out is Idlib province, which is in the northwest of Turkey, which is a controlled northwest of Syria, and which is largely controlled by Turkey because it is on the Turkish border. So one can understand that they would want to talk about that. But I cannot help but think that they were also talking about the bigger situation between Turkey and the United States and about the internal situation within Turkey itself and the links between Russia and Turkey, which we are now seeing evolving. And if you looked at that transcript carefully, Putin himself said that there's been a political dialogue between Turkey and Russia. Now that dialogue has to be taken further, and it needs to involve the key institutions of each of these two countries. And here we see the intelligence chief from Turkey is there, and the Russian defense chief, Shoigu, was also there.
Okay. Rumor has it that when the coup went down in Turkey, Russia warned Erdogan. And rumor has it that somehow, and I'm not saying this is true, somehow the United States and the man in exile, Erdogan's arch enemy, Gulen, were behind the coup or had something to do with the coup. Do you think the fact that this intelligence chief met with the Russian president, which is, I come from a diplomatic family, so I know this is very much a break in protocol. Usually a president meets with a president, a foreign minister meets with a foreign minister, intelligence chief meets with an intelligence chief, just like, for instance, Bolton met with his counterpart in Russia the other day. Exactly. So this is, like you said, highly odd. What do you think? Do you think there's some credence to what I just said, that maybe there is another attempt to be rid of Erdogan?
Well, let's go back to that coup in 2016. I mean, there were reports circulating in the Arab and Iranian media that the Russians, through electronic intelligence, found out that there was a coup being plotted against Erdogan, and that they tipped off Turkish military intelligence, which in turn tipped Erdogan off. Now, what is very interesting about that is that there were all sorts of statements put out by various Russian and Turkish officials, including by Erdogan himself, which stopped short of actually and specifically denying that. You will surely remember that we covered that extensively on the Duran at the time. So I am inclined to believe that story is actually true. That was certainly the view that I developed at the time. The Russians have a very sophisticated intelligence operation in Syria. They are masters of electronic and communications intelligence. So I think it is likely that that was true, at least at some level. And that would have established a connection between the Russians and the Turkish military intelligence service, and that through that to Erdogan directly. So I think that is possible. Now, if we look at the other side of the story, I am not personally sure that the US was directly involved in the coup attempt of 2016, but I have no doubt at all that they would not have been at all sorry if that coup attempt had succeeded. And some people in the United States, maybe not acting officially, do seem to have been implicated in it in some ways. I mean, there's this mysterious cleric, well, he's not so mysterious, this cleric, Islamic cleric, Gulen, who has this important and powerful religious movement in Turkey, and he is, of course, based in the United States. And we've had all sorts of other strange people involved, like this mysterious pastor who the Turkish government has placed under arrest and who's been prosecuted in Turkey, and who the US has sanctioned Turkey because they're not releasing him. So there is clearly an issue about Erdogan's personal stability. The United States is clearly not happy with the independent course he has been charting for Turkey, and about the fact that he's been getting so close to the Russians and buying arms from Russia and forging pipelines with Russia. We've discussed this in previous programs. There is some indications of, if not actual involvement by the US in the 2016 coup attempt, at least sympathy for it. And there's been rather stronger indications of the Russians acting to prevent that coup attempt from taking place. So, given how fraught the situation between the United States and Turkey has become, given the economic situation in Turkey, which has stabilized a little over the last couple of days, given, however, that Turkey and the US seem to be now almost in conflict, and the fact that the Turkish military has traditionally been very close to the US, I think it is entirely possible. I think it is in fact highly likely that in fact one of the reasons why that Turkish intelligence officer is in Russia is partly to reassure the Russians about Erdogan's own stability, but also perhaps to establish secure lines of communication between the Kremlin and Erdogan in case something else goes wrong in Turkey. I think that is entirely likely, and it would explain why he was there.
Going back to Syria, and we'll close out this segment with Syria, which is what the Kremlin says was the main topic of discussion between everyone involved. You mentioned I guess you could call it the last battle in Idlib, which is the last part of Syria, which is to be liberated from the terrorists. There was a strange story that I picked out of Sputnik the other day, which said that the Russian Defense Ministry is saying that the US, the UK, and France are working with jihadists to stage another chemical attack in which then they would retaliate, the US, the UK, and France. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has come out with many of these statements in the past. Some have come true, some have not. Do you also believe that the Turkish officials were meeting with Putin to possibly discuss the last battle in Idlib and a possible retaliation or an excuse for a retaliation by the US, UK, and France before all of Syria is effectively liberated?
I think that is highly likely. In fact, I think it is a very strong possibility. Now, I think the thing to say about this is that, of course, we saw on 2 occasions alleged chemical weapons attacks. The most recent one in Duma, in East Ghouta, has been almost totally discredited following an OPCW investigation. But that, of course, the media in the West has barely reported about. But I mean, there have been these provocations.
They haven't reported on it at all, Alexander.
Well, exactly. They haven't reported it at all. But I mean, we now know that there wasn't a chemical weapons attack, even though the US and the Western powers said there was, and nonetheless, as we now know, they carried out a missile strike on Syria on that pretext. So I'm afraid there is form, and I think these reports are almost certainly true. I think that there are schemes to launch another missile strike to try and save Idlib province from final liberation, if you like. Save the jihadis there. The point is that the reason there haven't been more missile strikes is because the Russians repeatedly warn against them. And they always have indicated that, if missile strikes happen, and if those missile strikes start crossing Russian red lines, the Russians will retaliate. And that has always caused the Western powers to back off. Now, I know it's never in the Western media presented that way, but if you study this closely, and at the Duran, we have done so. I mean, if you go through the history of our articles on this, yours and mine, we've looked at this question with great care. But the Russians have always acted to warn off the US from taking any kind of military action in Syria that would really change the situation in Syria. And the US has always backed off. And I think that is what the Russians are doing now. What the Russians, however, also want is to make sure that when the liberation of Idlib begins, and I think liberation, by the way, is absolutely the right word. I think it should be very clearly said that the people who are in control of Idlib province are people aligned with and controlled by Al-Qaeda. I mean, this is not really, for anybody who follows the situation, really in dispute. When Idlib is liberated, they also want to make sure that the Turks are on side, that they don't interfere or involve themselves in Idlib province in a way that will complicate this liberation strategy. And at the same time, they don't want to humiliate the Turks because of the importance of Turkey in the relationship with Russia at the present time. So the Russians are playing, as always in Syria, an extremely careful game. They're talking to the Turks, they're warning the Americans, the Syrian military is being built up around Idlib province, and of course the Turks have their own things that they want to talk to the Russians about, which we've touched previously on this segment. So, as I said, we're looking at a very interesting and very complicated diplomatic game. But can I just add one final thing? The one thing we've learned from the Syrian war is that the Russians are masters at this. They really know how to play this game. They've done it, they've played it with immense skill. And I am sure that they will continue to do this until that day when there is no more foreign troops left on Syrian soil.
I was just about to say the same thing. When it comes to diplomacy, the Russians are in a league of their own. They're very careful, and they think in the very long term. And they're very measured. And I totally agree with you on that point.
Yes.
Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below and click on that notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. And please visit the Duran shop, buy a t-shirt, help support us so we can continue to broadcast news stories like this direct to you. Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Until next time, take care.